There was a time when I believed that being agreeable made me valuable, that my softness was a virtue only if it meant being endlessly flexible, and that the highest compliment a woman could receive was how easy she was to be around. Before we dive into 7 habits that make a woman with boundaries unmatched, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this. I learned early on that silence was safer than truth, that comfort was currency, and that being chosen often required disappearing myself in small and socially acceptable ways. It was not called boundarylessness then, it was called femininity. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You said yes when everything inside you pulsed with no. You picked your words like flowers in someone else's garden, always careful not to bruise their mood. And people loved you for it. They loved your compliance, your warmth, your predictable ability to put everyone else first. But beneath the praise and the politeness, there lived a fracture. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what happens when your very self has been shaped into a performance for the benefit of others? What happens when your goodness is measured by your ability to tolerate mistreatment with grace? Women have been conditioned for generations to embody emotional hospitality, to hold space for everyone but themselves. And that hospitality, without boundaries, becomes a slow erasure. A woman without boundaries loses the sound of her own soul beneath the noise of pleasing. She becomes a mirror for other people's desires, never quite sure what hers look like. She learns to abandon herself in microscopic ways, agreeing to plans that drain her, laughing at jokes that sting, forgiving betrayals without repair, and calling it maturity. And the world, in its dysfunction, rewards her for it. But something sacred happens the moment she begins to question that reward, when she feels the first flicker of rage beneath her smile. When she stops saying, "I'm fine," through clenched teeth. When she notices how her body recoils after another one-sided conversation, or how exhausted she feels after holding emotional weight that was never hers to carry. That is not weakness, that is awakening. It is the beginning of reclamation, the sacred return to the self the world asked her to betray. Boundaries are not barriers, they are bridges back to wholeness. They are the architecture of a woman who no longer seeks safety in being liked. They are the language of self-trust. A woman with boundaries remembers that her life is her own, that her time is not a gift to be stolen, that her energy is a resource, not a buffet, that her body is a temple, not a negotiation. The boundaryless woman the world once preferred is fading, and, in her place rises someone far more powerful. A woman who no longer edits herself for fragile egos. A woman who can hold discomfort without absorbing it. A woman who does not owe her story to anyone who only wants the version that flatters them. This woman is not bitter. She is clear. She is not closed. She is consecrated. And her boundaries are not walls built from pain. They are gates woven from wisdom. She is no longer here to be easy. She is here to be whole. And that, in a world that still prefers women small and apologetic, makes her unmatched. Carl Jung believed that the journey of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole, is not about perfection, but about integration. It is the art of recovering the self from the projections, expectations, and cultural imprints that were never ours to carry. For the woman reclaiming her boundaries, this is not just an emotional shift, it is a spiritual and psychological metamorphosis. She is no longer living from her persona, the mask she once wore to be palatable to a world uncomfortable with her fullness. Instead, she is learning to live from her center. Jung described the self as the totality of the conscious and unconscious psyche, the core truth buried beneath layers of adaptation. And it is this truth that boundaries protect. They are not cruel. They are sacred. They say, "This is where I end and you begin," not to divide, but to preserve. Because without that line, without that delineation, there can be no real connection, only fusion, enmeshment, exhaustion. A woman without boundaries becomes a psychic sponge for the needs of others, absorbing their chaos and mistaking it for compassion. But the self-aware woman recognizes the difference between empathy and martyrdom. She understands that the soul can only bloom in soil that respects its root system. Jung warned of the dangers of projection, the unconscious act of assigning our disowned qualities onto others. And insecure people often project their unmet needs, their inner chaos, and their shadow selves onto women who seem capable of holding it all. They confuse containment with responsibility. They hand her the weight of their healing and resent her when she eventually sets it down. A woman with boundaries becomes threatening to these people, not because she is unkind, but because she reflects their lack of self-regulation. She becomes a mirror they cannot manipulate. And in a world where many relationships are built on silent contracts of self-abandonment, the boundary-setting woman is an interruption. She stops the game before it starts. She names the pattern no one else would dare speak aloud. She chooses truth over harmony and alignment over approval, and yes, that choice will cost her. Jung reminds us that the shadow must be faced if we are to become whole, and facing it often means being labeled difficult, too much, cold, or arrogant. But she knows now that those labels are projections. They are the last cries of a system that once benefited from her compliance. Sacred separation is not isolation, it is clarity. It is knowing who you are apart from how others define you. It is the internal silence that comes when you no longer argue with someone else's version of your worth. The woman walking this path becomes quieter, not because she has nothing to say, but because her energy no longer leaks through unguarded gates. She listens to her gut instead of her guilt. She rests without justification. She says no without explanation, and in doing so, she becomes not just whole but holy. She is no longer a reservoir for other people's unprocessed pain. She is an altar of self-respect. Her boundaries are not punishments, they are invitations for real intimacy. They say, "Meet me where I stand or do not meet me at all." That is not arrogance. That is individuation. That is the woman who has come home to herself. The first habit that makes a woman with boundaries truly unmatched is this: she chooses clarity over comfort, even when it costs her the approval that once felt like oxygen. This habit may sound simple, but it is radical in practice, especially for women who were groomed to prioritize harmony above honesty. From childhood, many are taught to smooth tension, to sugarcoat truth, to sacrifice clarity so no one else feels discomfort. But the self-possessed woman refuses to wear that leash anymore. Carl Jung spoke often about the necessity of confronting the truth within, even when it shattered the illusions we've built our lives upon. And for her, clarity is not just a habit, it is a spiritual compass. It governs how she communicates, how she loves, how she decides, and how she walks away. This woman no longer says maybe when she means no. She no longer offers half-truths to soothe fragile egos. She knows that avoidance breeds resentment, and that silence can be just as violent as a lie. She does not dress up her truth in niceties or sell it for peace that only exists on the surface. When she speaks, her words carry weight not because they are loud, but because they are honest. This kind of clarity is threatening to those who are used to her softness being synonymous with silence. It unnerves the emotionally entitled, who relied on her ambiguity to continue taking without consequence. But this woman understands that love without truth is control wearing a mask. She would rather disappoint someone with her honesty than betray herself with compliance. This is not cruelty, this is precision, and the world is not used to women being that precise. Jung believed that neurosis often results from a refusal to face necessary truths, and many relationships, romantic, familial, professional, become sites of unconscious avoidance, where both parties collude in denying what must be named, but not with her. The woman who practices this habit is not looking for drama, she is looking for alignment. She does not speak to provoke, she speaks to illuminate. She trusts that those meant for her will not flinch at her clarity, and those who do were only ever holding on to the version of her that kept them comfortable. This habit shows up in how she leaves, too. She no longer lingers in places where her needs must shrink to be met. She does not ghost or disappear, she articulates. She names the rupture. She does not wait to be mistreated 3 more times before acknowledging the pattern. Clarity makes her departure clean, her decisions grounded, her peace sustainable. And because she no longer fears being misunderstood, she is free. Free from over-explaining, free from the compulsion to be liked, free from the shackles of guilt that once kept her entangled in other people's emotional reactions. Clarity, after all, is not about control, it is about consent. It gives others the dignity of choosing how to respond to her truth, and in that space, real connection becomes possible. because what she offers is not performance, but presence. What she stands on is not fear, but self-respect. This is the woman who wakes up with a clear conscience, sleeps with a settled heart, and lives unshaken by the emotional weather of those who never learned how to face themselves. She has chosen clarity, and in doing so, she has chosen power. The second habit that makes a woman with boundaries utterly unmatched is her refusal to dress her no in guilt. While the world often demands that women justify every boundary with softness, apology, or self-deprecation, she simply doesn't. She does not wince when she says no, she does not decorate it with excuses, and she does not leave the door cracked open just to seem agreeable. Her no is clear, clean, and complete, not because she is cold, but because she is self-respecting. Carl Jung believed that every act of individuation requires a death of the false self, and this habit is precisely that, the death of the people-pleasing self that once needed others to validate every decision. This woman has grieved the parts of her that once over-explained, that once softened truth until it became unrecognizable, that once believed being needed was the same as being loved. Now, when she declines an invitation, an expectation, or an emotional demand, she does it with stillness. She does not perform guilt. She does not scan the room for signs of approval. She has learned that the cost of self-betrayal is far greater than the discomfort of disappointing someone who was never entitled to her in the first place. Insecure people interpret her no as a personal offense, because they have built their comfort on her compliance. But she knows the difference between being cruel and being clear. She knows that self-respect isn't rude, and that boundaries are not an act of aggression, they are a declaration of sovereignty. Her no does not require evidence. It is not a court case. It is not a thesis statement. It is an act of spiritual maturity, and when she says it, she does not flinch, because behind that, no is a woman who has done the inner excavation, a woman who has met the frightened child inside her who once believed she had to earn safety by making herself small, a woman who has forgiven the earlier versions of herself who said yes out of fear, obligation, or the desperate need to be chosen. She has grown past that now. Jung wrote that, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and nothing brings her closer to that truth than honoring her no without needing anyone's permission to do so." This habit shows up in the smallest moments, when she closes her laptop after work hours without guilt, when she declines the call that drains her, when she steps away from a conversation that disrespects her energy. It also shows up in the seismic ones, when she ends the relationship that feeds on her silence, when she walks out of the job that devours her worth, when she steps out of roles she never consented to play. Her no is not punishment, it is liberation. And she does not fear being called selfish, intimidating, or too much, because she knows that women are only labeled that way when they stop giving others unlimited access to their soul. This is the kind of no that makes her powerful, not because it protects her from life's storms, but because it anchors her through them. She has nothing to prove, no guilt to carry, and no apology to offer for choosing herself. Her no is sacred, and that is what makes it unforgettable. There is a pivotal moment in every self-possessed woman's journey where she stops performing her worth for those too blind or broken to see it, and that is where habit 3 emerges like a quiet revolution. She no longer explains her value, not in relationships, not in meetings, not in rooms where small men wield authority like a sword sharpened by insecurity. She does not list her accomplishments to gain approval. She does not repackage her intelligence to make others comfortable. And she no longer softens her instincts in the hopes that someone will finally recognize her enough to stop questioning her. This habit, Jung would say, is an expression of the self, a woman no longer fragmented by the projections of others, but living from an inner truth that cannot be argued into silence. To stop explaining your worth is to grieve the old dance of overcompensation. It is to stop auditioning for love in rooms where the script has already been written to keep you small. She no longer explains why she walks away from disrespect, why she doesn't engage with manipulative tactics masked as charm, why she demands reciprocity, or why she refuses to be reduced to someone's emotional crutch. Insecure people are threatened by this silence because they depend on confusion to maintain control. They ask, "Why are you so cold?" When they can no longer drain her energy, they demand, "What makes you think you're better?" when they can no longer use shame to tether her to their story. but she doesn't bite. She has learned that defending her worth is not only exhausting, it's unnecessary. The more she explains herself, the more she hands her power to those who would rather dissect her than understand her. So now, she speaks less but means more. She walks into rooms without shrinking. She exits conversations that insult her intelligence. She lets people misunderstand her if it means preserving her peace. Her self-esteem is no longer a negotiation. Jung believed that every person must confront the shadow, and in the life of a self-aware woman, that shadow often takes the form of the pleaser, the part of her that once begged to be seen, to be validated, to be told she was enough. But now, she no longer needs those crumbs. She is not bitter, just awake. She is not guarded, just rooted. And if someone cannot feel her worth without being spoon-fed her backstory, her proof, her heart laid bare on a silver platter, then they are not her people. Her presence is now her answer. Her boundaries are now her biography. Her life, lived in alignment, is now her introduction. She no longer gives lengthy explanations because she has nothing left to prove. The more still she becomes, the louder her power speaks. People sense it in how she looks them in the eye without flinching. They feel it in how she no longer overextends to make others feel comfortable. They notice it when she leaves the party early without needing an excuse, when she rejects the offer that does not meet her standards, when she remains unmoved in the face of passive aggression. She is not here to beg to be chosen. She is not here to explain why she deserves respect. She already knows, and if others can't feel it, then they were never meant to sit at her table in the first place. This is not arrogance, this is embodiment, and that is what makes her unforgettable. There is a kind of woman who doesn't storm out of rooms, doesn't scream to be heard, and doesn't collapse in the wake of rejection, and that woman has mastered one of the rarest and most disarming habits of all. She walks away without drama, not because she feels nothing, but because she has outgrown the belief that someone else's chaos deserves her performance. This is habit 4, and it is the turning point that separates a woman still tethered to cycles of emotional validation from one who has learned the sacred art of self-respect in motion. Jung once said that neurosis is the suffering of a soul that has not found its meaning, but a woman who knows her value no longer clings to the meaningless. She does not argue her way into love. She does not stay behind to manage someone else's discomfort. She does not turn her heartbreak into theater. She exits with clarity, grace, and the quiet thunder of someone who finally knows she owes no one a final monologue. The insecure will call her cold, the needy will call her ruthless. But what she really is, what they cannot bear to name, is free. She has spent too many nights over-explaining her boundaries to people who never intended to honor them. She has given too many second chances to men who mistook her softness for surrender. She has apologized too many times for simply asking to be met with consistency. And now, she no longer leaves a trail of words to make others comfortable with her departure. She knows the truth. When you explain your exit too much, you give the person you're leaving a script to rewrite the story. Instead, she leaves in silence, letting absence speak where words once begged. She walks away before bitterness sets in. She walks away before her love curdles into resentment. She walks away while her integrity is still intact, and that unnerves those who mistook her presence for permanence. They thought she'd stay out of loyalty. They thought she'd compromise just one more time. But she has learned that staying too long in places that dishonor you is a form of self-betrayal, and she is done betraying herself. Her peace is not up for debate. Her exit is not a punishment. It is a promise to herself. A promise that she will never again sacrifice her emotional clarity just to maintain an illusion of connection. She does not block, curse, or post cryptic messages. She does not sabotage or play victim. She just leaves, fully. And in doing so, she breaks a pattern so old, so inherited, that her great-grandmothers rise in her spirit to witness it. This habit makes her unmatched, because it signals a woman who is no longer addicted to potential, no longer hooked on chaos, and no longer willing to play games that cost her peace. She does not need closure from someone who refused to offer clarity while she was still present. She does not need apologies to validate her decision. She does not fear solitude, because solitude is where she remembers who she is. In a world that rewards spectacle, her quiet departure becomes a sacred rebellion. The The ones who underestimated her composure now sit in the echo of her absence, confused by the weight of a goodbye that came with no noise but left nothing standing. And in that silence, she becomes unforgettable. Because power does not always slam doors. Sometimes it just turns the handle and never looks back. There is a moment in every self-respecting woman's journey when she realizes that being liked is a trepan, invisible leash that tugs at her every time she dares to speak up, say no, or choose differently. That moment doesn't come with fanfare. It often arrives quietly, in the middle of a conversation where she hears herself agreeing to something she doesn't want, laughing at something that stings, or apologizing for a boundary that shouldn't require explanation. And in that moment, something inside her wakes up. She sees how often she's traded her self-respect for social approval, how often she's kept herself small to make others feel comfortable, how often she's chosen politeness over authenticity. That's when habit 5 is born. She chooses self-respect over being liked, not once, not dramatically, but again and again, in 1,000 small decisions that no one sees. This is the habit that makes her impossible to manipulate, because she no longer softens her truth for the sake of belonging. She no longer edits herself to fit into rooms that were never built to hold the full weight of her presence. She no longer breaks her back to make sure others don't feel threatened by her voice, her boundaries, her brilliance. Jung understood this when he said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And this woman has claimed that privilege by letting go of the need to be palatable. Insecure people cannot control her because she's not trying to earn their approval. She does not fear their disappointment, their gossip, or their withdrawal. She has faced the fear of being misunderstood and survived it. She has endured the loneliness of standing alone and grown stronger in it. She has walked through the fire of losing people who only loved the version of her that bled silence and compliance, and now she stands on the other side of that fire with a clarity that cannot be shaken. She would rather be seen as difficult than live dishonestly. She would rather be called intimidating than shrink herself to soothe someone's ego. She would rather be alone in truth than surrounded in false connection. Her yes means something now because it is no longer automatic. Her no is not a negotiation, it is a full sentence, delivered without apology. And the people around her feel the shift. Some admire her. Some resent her. Some try to guilt her back into the old mold. But she does not move, because her peace is built on something solid now. It's built on knowing that being liked is fickle, but being true to yourself is sacred. It's built on the muscle memory of every time she betrayed herself just to avoid someone else's discomfort and the vow she made to never do it again. In a world that trains women to be pleasing above all else, she is dangerous because she refuses to perform. She speaks truthfully, acts intentionally, and protects her dignity like it is the root of her survival. Because it is, and every time someone tries to pull her back into the people-pleasing script, she meets them with a gaze that says, "I know who I am now, and I will not betray her again." That is what makes her untouchable. That is what makes her powerful. That is what makes her unforgettable. There is a quiet kind of mastery in the woman who has made peace with her emotions without making them someone else's problem. She doesn't suppress them, doesn't hide behind a smile that doesn't reach her eyes, and doesn't lash out to make her pain louder than the room. Instead, she sits with her feelings like old companions who no longer scare her. Habit 6 is this: she owns her emotions without weaponizing them. That is not a performance of emotional neutrality. It's not stoicism wrapped in feminine packaging. It's presence, it's integrity. It's the power to name what she feels without expecting someone else to fix it, absorb it, or pay for it. This habit is rare because many women were taught to use emotion as current Saito cry for closeness, to sulk for control, to rage for attention, to smile for survival. But the self-respecting woman sees clearly that manipulation, even in its softest form, is still betrayal. Jung would call this emotional integration, where the unconscious no longer hijacks her reactions and her shadow no longer leaks through her tone. She has looked at the roots of her anger, her sadness, her jealousy, her joy, and instead of judging or justifying them, she simply claimed them. This is what makes her different. Insecure people try to use their feelings as leverage, but she doesn't negotiate with guilt or punishment. If she's hurt, she says sono to shame you, but to stay honest. If she's angry, She knows it's hers to examine, not yours to soothe. If she's joyful, she doesn't downplay it to make others comfortable. Her emotions are no longer weapons or walls, they are windows. And the people around her feel that. They feel the clarity, the maturity, the strength. And yes, some find it terrifying. Because you cannot manipulate someone who doesn't need to make you the villain of her story to validate her experience. You cannot play games with someone who doesn't use silence as punishment or vulnerability as bait. She does not collapse into tears for effect. She does not perform forgiveness to avoid discomfort. She knows what she feels, she knows why she feels it, and she knows what to do with it. That is emotional sovereignty. That is what Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This woman has done that work. So when someone tries to provoke her or twist her words, she doesn't explode or retreat. She observes, she listens, she decides, and then she responds from a place of calm power, not reactive chaos. That unnerves manipulators who expect to script tears, yelling, sulking, begging, but she doesn't play the old roles anymore. Her emotions are not weapons because she no longer fights for validation. She already belongs to herself, and when a woman owns her inner world like that, she becomes a fortress of truth, not because she is cold, but because she is whole. Not because she suppresses feeling, but because she honors it, not because she doesn't care, but because she cares deeply with boundaries. In a world where people expect women to either explode or disappear, she does neither. She remains rooted, radiant, responsible. And that kind of emotional clarity is not just rare, it's revolutionary. There's a silence most people run from, the kind that echoes when no one is calling, no one is texting, no one is checking in or choosing you. For many, that silence becomes a reason to compromise, to lower the bar just enough so someone, anyone, can reach it, but not her. Habit 7 is this. She stays rooted in her standards even when she's lonely. That is what makes her unmatched. She knows what she wants, what she deserves, and what she will never again tolerate, not because she read it in a book or heard it on a podcast, but because she paid for that clarity with years of self-abandonment, shrinking and pretending not to care. She's done accepting breadcrumbs and calling it a feast. She's done mistaking attention for affection and connection for commitment. Jung once said that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. And she has lived that. She has sat in rooms full of people who didn't really see her, dated men who liked the idea of her but not the reality, kept friends who didn't know how to hold space for the whole of her. And through all of it she learned that being alone is not the worst thing, settling is. So now, she holds her standard like a compass. Not a sword, not a shield, but a quiet truth she no longer betrays. Even when the nights stretch long and the silence hums, she does not call back the one who ghosted. She does not chase the one who breadcrumbed. She does not convince someone to choose her. Her love is not a campaign. Her worth is not a debate. Her standards are not a punishment. They are a reflection of how deeply she now respects herself, and that respect is unwavering. She would rather spend a Friday night alone with a book and her own integrity than on a date that requires her to shrink, explain, or settle. She knows the price of peace, and she is no longer afraid to pay it. Insecure people call her picky, difficult, too proud, but what they really mean is she's no longer easily fooled, no longer easily swayed by empty promises or temporary warmth, no longer willing to trade authenticity for attachment. She has tasted the freedom of not needing to be chosen and found it more satisfying than any forced connection. That scares those who rely on others' desperation to feel powerful, because they can't control a woman who is not afraid to wait, not afraid to be misunderstood, not afraid to lose what isn't aligned. When someone approaches her now, they feel it, the weight of her standard, the depth of her clarity, the quiet strength of a woman who does not move just because she is alone. And if they can't rise to meet her, she doesn't fall, she remains, rooted in who she has become, not who she once begged to be loved as. And in that posture, she becomes magnetic. Not because she's available, but because she's sovereign. Not because she's easy to win over, but because she's impossible to fake it with. That is the power of staying rooted. That is the quiet revolution of a woman who no longer fears loneliness more than she fears settling. That is what makes her unforgettable. There comes a moment when the world begins to notice Eno because she raised her voice, not because she begged to be seen, but because her consistency in choosing herself has created a quiet, gravitational pull. It's not accidental, it's not luck. It's the outcome of years spent relearning what it means to matter to herself. The woman with unshakable boundaries, who stays rooted in her standards even through loneliness, starts to shift the spaces she enters. People notice the way she doesn't flinch when questioned, the way she doesn't perform when silence would be more honest, the way she doesn't bite the hook of passive aggression or invitations to explain her choices. She becomes the presence that makes others recalibrate, because her energy no longer asks, "Am I too much?" or "Did I do something wrong?" but instead states with quiet certainty, "This is who I am. There is no arrogance in it, only alignment." Jung taught that the fully individuated self no longer chases projections, no longer pleads with the outside world for confirmation, but becomes whole from within. She is living that truth now. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but with devotion. And it shows. She enters rooms without needing to be the loudest, yet all eyes still find her. Not because of what she wears or how she moves, but because of what she refuses to abandon within herself. Her aura isn't curated, it's earned. Through heartbreaks she didn't romanticize, friendships she let die rather than beg for crumbs, standards she held even when her knees shook from standing alone. The power she exudes isn't defiance, it's coherence. Her inside matches her outside. Her words align with her actions. Her yes means yes. Her no is final. And that kind of woman is deeply disorienting to those who still operate from manipulation, guilt, or performance. They don't know what to do with someone who isn't swayed by flattery, who isn't addicted to approval, who doesn't crumble when misunderstood. She doesn't need them to understand. She just needs to remain clear within herself, and so she does. With every interaction, she reinforces her own sense of safety, not through control, but through clarity. Not through dominance, but through discernment. She leaves conversations that spiral into chaos. She doesn't match energy, she maintains her own. She gives people the dignity of their choices, but she also grants herself the freedom to walk away without apology. And that is the kind of grace that stings, because it's not angry, it's not cruel, it's not performative, it's just done. That kind of woman cannot be manipulated, cannot be owned, cannot be reduced. Because her sense of self is not on the table, she has already chosen herself, over and over, in quiet ways, in unseen ways, and now that choice emanates from her, like truth. She doesn't convince, she doesn't chase, she doesn't collapse, she observes, she protects, she decides, and that is why people remember her. Not because she entertained their projections, but because she shattered them with silence. Not because she bent to keep them close, but because she stayed whole when they expected her to break. This is not a phase, this is not a performance. This is the permanent posture of a woman who has become the keeper of her own soul. And from that place she is not just respected, she is revered. People often assume that when a woman becomes self-contained, she must be cold, unfeeling, unreachable. But what they fail to grasp is that warmth from a woman like this is not absent, it is intentional. It is not spilled freely for the sake of being liked. It is not available on demand to soothe the wounded egos of those who haven't earned access. Her love has not diminished, but it has evolved. It now comes with a gate, not a revolving door, and that distinction makes all the difference. She no longer performs kindness at the expense of her truth, nor does she extend emotional labor as a way to be perceived as good, because goodness without boundaries is not goodness, it's martyrdom. She knows now that the most powerful thing a woman can do is to love from fullness, not from fracture. That is habit 6. She gives from overflow, not obligation. This shift rattles people who are used to accessing women through guilt, who mistake generosity for self-erasure. But the woman who has arrived at this level of self-respect knows the difference between generosity and self-abandonment. She has studied herself too deeply to confuse the two ever again. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole, and part of that wholeness means no longer splitting yourself to meet others halfway who refuse to move. The woman who gives from overflow has done the work to tend to her emotional soil. She has pulled up the weeds of codependency and people-pleasing, has watered her own roots in silence, has waited through seasons of loneliness rather than harvesting love from barren fields. Now, when she offers her attention, it carries weight. When she shows up, it matters, because she is no longer leaking energy in 1,000 directions, hoping to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. And from that place, her love becomes a sacred act, not a transaction. Insecure people, especially men who have been taught that a woman's worth lies in her selflessness, may feel threatened by this. They will label her selfish, difficult, too much. But she knows that these are not truths. They are projections from those who relied on her old patterns of depletion, and she does not take them personally anymore. She doesn't flinch when misunderstood. She doesn't rush in to explain her choices, because she knows that someone who demands endless access is not asking for love, they are asking for power, and she will not be complicit in her own diminishment again. Not for connection, not for peace, not for anyone. So when she gives Noah time, her affection, her presence, it is real, it is clean, it is rooted in sovereignty. And that makes it unforgettable. It also makes it rare, because the world is not yet used to women who love from overflow. But when they encounter one, they feel it, the steadiness, the clarity, the refusal to perform. She becomes a mirror to everyone around her, reflecting where they have not yet tended to themselves. Some will rise to meet her, others will recoil, but she does not adjust her posture to keep anyone comfortable. She keeps pouring only when her own cup is full, and she does so without shame. That is what makes her powerful, not just her capacity to give, but her discipline in protecting the wellspring from which that giving flows. She is not less loving now, she is simply less available to be emptied. There's a particular silence that follows a woman who no longer abandons herself to be understood. It's not the silence of defeat or withdrawal, but the grounded stillness of someone who no longer performs her worth. This woman, having learned to give only from overflow, now begins to realize that her energy has always been the most potent form of currency she possessed. And that brings us to habit 7. She no longer entertains what drains her. It sounds simple, but for a woman who was once conditioned to be polite, to make others feel comfortable at the expense of her own peace, this shift is seismic. She no longer sits at tables where conversation feels like currency and her silence is mined for secrets. She no longer allows proximity to become a substitute for alignment. Because now she feels it instantly when a room asks her to shrink, when a friendship no longer nourishes her, when a conversation leaves her buzzing with anxiety instead of anchored in truth. She feels it not as drama, but as data. She doesn't make it about rejection or blame. She simply listens. Jung spoke often of the unconscious and how it guides us through dreams and discomforts. For this woman, discomfort is no longer something to avoid, it's a compass, and when her body says no, she believes it the first time. That alone makes her dangerous to those who once relied on her doubt. They no longer have access to the version of her who second-guessed her needs. She has reclaimed her instincts, and that reclamation has made her life quieter, but richer. Now, instead of managing the emotions of others, she curates her space like a sacred garden. She chooses softness, but not submission. She chooses solitude, but not loneliness. She surrounds herself with people who understand the gravity of her yes, because they've seen her use her no. And when someone tries to guilt her into staying in what she has outgrown, she doesn't flinch. She doesn't explain. She simply exits, not with cruelty, but with clarity, because she knows now that staying too long in what drains you is not loyalty, it's self-harm, and she has chosen healing. Her absence, once a tool used against her, is now a boundary in motion. People may not understand. They may say she's changed, that she's cold, that she thinks she's better, but she knows the truth. She hasn't hardened, she's just no longer available for dynamics that require her to diminish. And in this new chapter, she doesn't seek applause. She doesn't need validation for every exit she makes or for every silence she keeps. Her peace is her proof. Her radiance speaks for itself. She no longer fears being misunderstood by those committed to misreading her. She understands now that some people loved her because she didn't love herself enough to leave. Now that she does, they call it betrayal, but she calls it self-respect. This habit of protecting her peace, of refusing what drains her, of honoring her nervous system as much as she once honored everyone else's comforties, what elevates her beyond being merely strong. It makes her unmatched. It makes her whole. And in a world that still mistakes a woman's exhaustion for virtue, she has become something far more dangerous. A woman who refuses to apologize for no longer betraying herself. That is the truest power of all. She doesn't fight to be seen anymore. She lives in such a way that only the seeing can stay. When a woman stops betraying herself, the world around her begins to shift, often uncomfortably. The ones who once praised her for being so easy to work with, so understanding, so chill, start to feel unsettled, though they can't name why. It's because she no longer offers herself as the emotional cushion for their chaos. This next evolution leads us into habit 8. She does not manage other people's discomfort with her truth. She no longer dilutes her words to soothe egos or avoids naming things clearly out of fear that someone will call her difficult. The moment she started choosing herself, she became a mirror, and mirrors are rarely welcomed by those still hiding from themselves. But this woman no longer shatters her reflection to make others more comfortable. She has learned that discomfort is not harm, and someone else's triggered response to her truth is not her responsibility. Once, she would have twisted herself into knots trying to be palatable. She would have rehearsed her tone, softened her language, apologized before speaking. Now, she speaks clean and clear. Not cruelly, not recklessly, but with the precision of someone who has peeled away the need to be liked, because she knows that being liked was never the same as being respected. And more often than not, the people who demanded her likability were the same ones who dismissed her boundaries. In Jungian terms, she has confronted her own shadow and no longer fears being seen as too much. She doesn't chase likability because she has integrated the parts of herself that once made her shrink. Anger, sadness, ambition, desire, these are not things to suppress, but signals to honor. So when someone looks uncomfortable in her presence, she doesn't rush to rescue them from that feeling. She understands that discomfort is often the first step toward growth, and she won't rob others of that transformation just to be more digestible. The cost is too high. The price is her soul. And she's not trading that again. In rooms where people try to minimize her clarity, she doesn't argue. She observes. She trusts what her body tells her. She listens to how her heart beats when someone laughs at her truth. She notices who interrupts, who invalidates, who changes the subject when she speaks plainly, and instead of shrinking, she expands. She doesn't manage the awkward pause. She doesn't laugh to break the tension. She lets it sit, because her nervous system has healed enough to hold the weight of her own truth, even when others cannot. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes her dangerous in the most sacred way. She is no longer the woman who softens herself to keep others from cracking. She does not build her life around other people's fragility. She is not unkind, but she is unmoved. And when someone flinches at her boundaries or tries to guilt her into silence, she doesn't flinch back. She remains rooted. Because she knows now that those who cannot sit with her clarity were never really hearing her in the first place. They were hearing their own discomfort echoing back. So she lets them sit with it. She lets them decide if they want to grow into the version of themselves who can meet her where she is. But she will not descend to meet them in places she's fought to rise from. She is no longer available for that journey. She lives at a higher altitude now, and not everyone has the lungs to breathe where she's going. By the time she releases the burden of managing everyone's emotional weather, she steps fully into the next evolution of self-respect. She no longer negotiates her self-worth in relationships that require her to prove it. This is habit 9, and it is not loud or performative. It is the quiet refusal to keep auditioning for love, approval, or inclusion. The woman who once lived on edge, waiting for someone to validate her presence, now knows she belongs to herself. She's done performing emotional gymnastics for people who only show up when it's convenient for them. The healed, self-possessed woman no longer sends long texts trying to explain her value, no longer overcompensates in the hope that someone will finally see her clearly, no longer overfunctions in dynamics that leave her under-acknowledged. She understands that anything requiring her to bend out of shape in order to be chosen is not love, it is emotional distortion. Jung spoke of the inner gold that many people seek outside themselves, and this woman has done the alchemical work of mining that gold from her own shadow. She has faced her wounds, sat in the grief, met the little girl within her who once believed she had to earn safety by being perfect or pleasing or useful, and now she protects that girl fiercely. She no longer drags her into rooms that echo with the same conditional love that wounded her in the first place. When someone treats her presence as optional, she treats their access to her as temporary. She does not threaten to walk away, she simply walks, not to punish, but to protect, not to manipulate, but to maintain alignment with who she has become. Because she has learned that begging for reciprocity where none exists is a betrayal of self, and she has made herself a promise. Never again will she barter her integrity for belonging. Her standards are not walls to keep people out, they are gates that open only for those willing to meet her with the same depth, the same presence, the same earned clarity. She no longer fears being alone, because solitude taught her how to hear her own voice, and that voice has become her compass. She knows now that peace is more valuable than attention, and that love without respect is just emotional noise. She does not chase chemistry that lacks consistency. She does not romanticize potential at the expense of her own needs. She watches how people show up, not just how they speak. And when someone offers her crumbs, she no longer imagines them as a feast. She simply leaves the table. What makes her powerful now is not how much she gives, but how discerning she has become with what she gives to whom. She does not explain herself to those committed to misunderstanding her. She does not beg for love that must be constantly earned. She simply moves forward, carrying the wisdom of every heartbreak she has turned into fuel. In doing so, she becomes the kind of woman insecure people cannot manipulate, because she no longer requires their approval to feel whole. She is not dangerous because she wants power over others. She is dangerous because she refuses to be mastered by anything that costs her peace. And that kind of power cannot be taken, only witnessed. It silences the room without raising its voice. There comes a moment when the woman who has reclaimed every piece of herself no longer seeks to be understood, she seeks to be whole. This final transformation is not about rebellion, retaliation, or resistance. It is about embodiment. It is habit 10. She lives in such alignment with her values, intuition, and self-respect that manipulation cannot find a foothold. She doesn't posture. She doesn't perform. She simply is. The final habit that makes a self-respecting woman impossible to manipulate is this. She walks in truth, even when it's lonely, especially when it's lonely. Because she knows the cost of abandoning herself just to be liked, and it is a price she will never pay again. She no longer fears the discomfort of silence, of disapproval, or of walking away. She has already survived the emotional poverty of relationships built on pretense. She has already tasted the emptiness of praise that comes only when she is small, agreeable, or silent. Jung once said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. And that's what she's done. She's integrated the soft with the sharp, the vulnerable with the discerning, the heart with the spine. She has learned that truth doesn't always win her applause, but it wins her peace. And she has made peace her home. The final version of her does not argue her worth. She does not try to rescue others from the consequences of their own dishonesty. She does not dilute her standards to fit someone else's limitations. She does not offer energy to people who treat her as an option. She does not give second chances to those who made her feel like she was hard to love the first time. And when she enters a room, she is not asking, "Will they like me?" She is asking, "Will this align with who I am becoming?" That shift changes everything. Because now, she evaluates opportunities, relationships, and invitations not through the lens of fear or scarcity, but through clarity and grounded power. And when someone attempts to manipulate her, they are met not with protest, not with panic, but with the stillness of a woman who already knows herself. Manipulation thrives in confusion, desperation, and disconnection. But she is clear, she is calm, she is connected to something deeper than approval. She is anchored in truth. That makes her immovable. That makes her magnetic. That makes her unforgettable. She no longer sees her boundaries as barriers to love, but as bridges to her freedom. She no longer mistakes control for care. And she no longer confuses attachment with love. Her detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the wisdom to know what is hers to hold and what is not. And that wisdom has become her power. She is no longer chasing closure, explanations, or redemption arcs in people who were never safe. She has already found all the closure she needs in her own evolution. And so she moves forward, not bitter, not broken, not burdened by the need to be chosen, but free, unapologetically free. And when people wonder what changed, the truth is, she didn't become someone else. She simply remembered who she was before the world told her to shrink, and she chose, this time, to never forget again.